Okay, welcome back to another episode of Critical Weight Theory. And this time I'm going to be looking at why some people, particularly young people, are in a moving state of mind. They're ready to leave the United States. And why is that? Well, the most obvious answer is the orange doofus. But you know what? I'm not going to so much get into that. I could just mention the orange doofus and leave it at that and end the episode right there. But you know what? I'm gonna do more than that. We're gonna cut through the noise and talk about what's really going on. Even in a more broad sense than that. So today's episode, we're diving into a question that's been showing up in headlines, forums, late night group chats, messages on Facebook or wherever. You might be on Blue Sky, you might be talking to people you know about it. There are probably letters to the editor on the topic. But why do so many young Americans want to leave, or why are they at least considering it? Leave their city, leave their state, sometimes even leave the country. Sure, not everything is bad now, but maybe you can say you're not having the time of your life. Maybe things are looking entirely dour. I don't know. But we hear murmurs about this, and the for a lot of millennials and Gen Z, the reality, you know, uh, of how things are doesn't match the storybook vibe that they're so often told about how America's supposed to be or whatever. So, what's going on exactly? Let's start with the obvious stuff people say. If they if they're in a cold area of the country, they might say it's too cold all year round. Maybe they want to move somewhere tropical or something like that. I'm sure some people are thinking that way. They might say there aren't enough job opportunities. Housing is insanely expensive. Maybe they want to take their chances somewhere else and see if they will fare any better. And yeah, those are legit. If your rent is half your paycheck or more, if your degree gets you nowhere, and if you're working long hours for low pay and zero benefits, why wouldn't you start looking for the exit? That's sort of how the free market works, right? If things aren't good where you are, you're going to go somewhere else. You're going to skedaddle. But the story doesn't stop at climate or cost of living. It goes a little bit deeper. That I think that deep down somewhere, I think in people's consciousness, they're getting tired of the myth of the lazy generation. They're tired of young Americans being constantly shat upon. I'll just put it like that. And I think there's such a common trope about young people just being lazy or soft or whatever, that they're just like, you know what, I'm gonna leave this culture, this environment, and I'm gonna go somewhere where people aren't like that, where that's not such a common talking point. And if you're heading to another place where you don't have roots, it can be like an adventure as well. That's another aspect to it. So you've probably heard some of the things before that I'm talking about here. Young people are too soft. They want everything handed to them. They're allergic to discipline. Whatever. Hearing that for your entire young life, it can be a drag. So that's one reason I think some people are you know scrambling to get out, or at least considering it. And is it true that the young people are like that, or is that just nostalgia talking from the older, in some cases dumber folks? So let's break that down too, while we're talking about the dumb generational war here. So the older generations, they came up in different times, tougher in some ways, maybe. There was more manual labor, less tech, maybe delayed gratification. But of course, that's not the whole picture. Sure, millennials and Gen Z didn't walk 10 miles in the snow to school, at least not typically, but they did grow up during economic collapses, student loan crises, mass shootings, political turmoil, genocides, climate anxiety, and of course, you've got the algorithmic chaos of the internet and the uncertainty of the job market. That's why some people are wondering, well, how will I fare in an economy where my job could be on the chopping block? The reality is that things are really not all that clear. So you can try to chill and be the change you want to see, and make the best of where you are with what you've got, and that can be fine. But some people are thinking about leaving, or they maybe already left. So chilling isn't always easy when everything around you feels unstable, and being the change takes real work. Maybe some people think that's hopeless, and they don't have the resources where they're at, so they're gonna try their hand somewhere else. And questioning isn't the same as invalidating. So let's clear this one up. Just because young people are skeptical of old ideas or do things a different way, it doesn't mean they're delusional or lazy. It might mean they've grown up in a world flooded with misinformation, broken promises, and rapidly shifting norms. So they're forced to adapt constantly. So yes, they're critical, sometimes clumsy about it, but often they're trying to figure out what's true in a world that lies to them daily. You know what I mean? Old doesn't always mean right, and that's not disrespectful, that's survival. Redefining what work looks like is also going to be important in the future. Hard work hasn't disappeared, it just looks different. Content creators work insane hours, coders, activists, gig workers, freelancers. They're building careers in unpredictable, unstable environments. And you know what? I think they get, not enough credit for that. There's no pension waiting in most of these cases, no clear ladder to climb, just constant hustle. And when someone says young people don't want to work, maybe they just don't want your job or your definition of success. Maybe they're more interested in, getting what they can in a real job market, not a job market that appears to be fading. So that's why some people are trying to be innovative and, create their own path. And in some cases, they're pretty much forced to do that because the regular types of jobs, they just aren't paying enough. And of course, that's traditionally why you've had black market economies emerge in the first place. And I'm not necessarily talking about the black market, but this gig economy stuff and needing side job after side job, it's really going to be a test of how stable the economy can be. And affordability and mental health are a factor. So let's zoom out again and talk about that. People want to leave sometimes because they're tired of grinding, of drowning in debt, or of trying to build a future that always feels one step out of reach. You graduate with debt, not savings. You live near your college but can't afford to live in the city. Your job doesn't cover health care. Your neighborhood's polluted, and you know, uh, I was going to say everybody's doing stuff about, but nobody's doing anything about it. Is what I meant to say. I went down the. I used the exact opposite word of what I originally wanted to use there. So, it's not just about leaving, it's actually about escaping, you know, the the drudgery of it all. And that's kind of what young people are supposed to do traditionally, aren't they? In a lot of cases, go out on their own and try to carve a new path, be innovative, resourceful, and hopefully not fail too hard. So yeah, maybe the state ranks, whatever state you're talking about, ranks as the best by some experts. You know, uh, but if you're 27, underpaid, overworked, and still living at home, that label feels like a joke. I'm really living in a good state. But not that I see. You know, that's what a lot of people are telling themselves. They see whatever problems are around them, and they're like, okay, the best state compared to what? Absolute crap, absolute crap. You know. Sorry, just kind of lost my voice almost right there. Um, so that there are generational tensions, and I'm going to end with the idea that keeps emerging that young people are soft, weak, or coddled. So here's the truth that's been said about every generation by the one before it, that they're soft, weak, or coddled. You can literally go back hundreds, maybe even thousands of years, and there's actually a fun YouTube video that does that. They look at all the instances of, you know, older generations criticizing the younger ones, and it's something that has always happened. So what's different now is how loud and visible the tension is. Social media amplifies everything too, and I guess the main point is that the gap is kind of real. Older generations see delayed milestones, emotional openness, and tech dependency as weakness, but younger folks see it as, the way things have evolved. They just see it as normal. They're adapting to a different world with different challenges. And sometimes, you know, both the older and the younger generation have legitimate critiques. I'm not saying that there are no problems with younger people, of course. There will always be problems, but I guess the main point here is that, having problems is nothing new. It's just there's a different set of problems that people will have to deal with. So, what's the answer? Why are so many young people ready to leave? Because they're tired of just surviving, they want to start living. And if that means packing up and moving somewhere else, physically, emotionally, politically, then maybe we should stop blaming them and start listening. So that's it for this episode of Critical Weight Theory. I kind of fumbled in talking a few times, but that's all right. I think the rawness actually might be beneficial. I don't know. But if you liked what you heard when I was relatively coherent and wasn't jumbling words up, I guess you could subscribe, share the episode, or, just send it to the person who always says, back in my day, we had to blah, 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 blah. So, I guess one last note is, ironically, I'm one of those people who does walk everywhere. So I walk to work in blizzards and things like that, you know. So I'm one of those people who can say that sort of thing. But it's not for any special reason. It's just because I don't drive. So till next time, take care of yourself and don't be afraid to rethink everything. And remember, younger people are not always in the wrong. Sometimes it's the old folks who are faltering.